Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. And so the shock box, it had four. Started with 15, ended with 450, and it increased in increments of 15 volts. So it'd go 15, 45, 60, clear up to 450 volts. And the question that Milgram wanted to know is how many people would go up to 450 volts? And what he found is that about 2/3, 60, I believe it was 63% or 64, would go all the way up to 450 volts. Okay. And he found by just altering the experiment a little, you could get anywhere from 10% of people clear up to 90% of people to go up to shock someone to 450 volts. 10% is if you see someone stop and quit, you're more likely to quit. 90%, if you see someone like you go up to 450 volts, 90% of the time you'll go up to 450 volts. Okay. And what this study really is showing, and it kind of goes along with bystander stuff, it goes along with our willingness to harm other people, is what this shows is that individuals, despite their character, despite all of those things, are willing to harm another individual just at the command of some authority figure or someone in the room. Okay. Now, this research has been replicated to its best because it was actually done pretty unethically. So with ethical standards in place, it was redone, I believe, in like 2015. And it was the same results. So since the 1960s up till today, we still can get 2/3 of people to shock someone clear up to 450 volts. Okay. So this is one example of explanation of bullying, is this willingness to do something because someone is telling us to. And when we see bullying behavior, we actually see it often. There is a lead bully in the situation, and then there's individuals within that system supporting it and getting it, which we'll see in a slide or two here in just a minute. The other study that is interesting because it deals more with systems and institutions. How can these things happen with systems and institutions? And that's the Stanford prison studies, where they took, I believe it was 24, something like that, psychologically healthy young men, and they randomly assigned them to be guards or to be prisoners. The guards were given symbols of authority, and prestige. The prisoners were put in really humiliating, almost dress-like things. Were told to wear lady pantyhose over their head, and really in degrading, and they were referred to as a number, meaning that they were dehumanized. Okay, they were no longer given their humanness. Okay, now in this, the only instruction that was provided is you couldn't physically harm someone, but your job is to keep control of the prison, to keep control of the inmates. And the research was supposed to run for, I believe, 2 weeks. But given that there were no social controls to guide guards' behaviors, they were doing such humiliating things to the fellow student prisoners who were not felons at all. They were acting in an experiment, having them doing humiliating things such as simulating sodomy, having them wash toilets with their bare hands. They insulted them, they hurt them. Within 36 hours, young boys were having psychological breakdowns because of what was going on. They ended up ending the experiment in the first week because things had gotten so out of control that true psychological harm was starting to begin. On the victim end, they started to believe that they were truly prisoners. They couldn't escape their captor. Okay, this is very similar to what we see in bullying. Is when bullying happens, and we'll see this on that next slide, is they feel trapped. They feel like they can't escape the bullying. It's there, and they're psychologically and physical captives of it. And that's what we saw in the Stanford prison studies. And again, what we found in that study is if you give individuals the ability without oversight, some type of hierarchical authority or permission to have control over other people, you can get this type of behavior to occur in individuals. The real life example of the Stanford prison studies is, of course, the Abu Ghraib incidents in 2004, where military individuals did humiliating things to prisoners who weren't there because they've been gone through the court system, and they just completely humiliated them. And it was posted everywhere, and there were a lot of controversies behind that. So the Stanford prison studies and the Milgram studies are ways we can quantify and see this happening. And it usually has to do with the situational and context that the individual is in. Okay, so I just kind of wanted to put those two studies out there. And the other thing that I want to go back to the Milgram studies with is there was a few studies where Milgram said, will you shock this person with 450 volts on the first wrong answer? And a very small percentage, we're talking under 5% of people said yes, or they were willing to do it. The only way the Milgram studies worked is if you started with small incremental amounts and you increased over and over and over and over until you hit that 450 volt sign. And this is very analogous to bullying. And I'll also say this is very analogous to family violence or domestic violence, in that bullying doesn't start all of a sudden with bam in your face. It usually starts with little insults in schools, shoving in the hallway, social exclusion, making fun of clothing, those kinds of things. And it builds up slowly until it gets to the point, as in this picture shows, they're kicking this young individual in the picture. And that's also part of the bullying process. And again, I think I mentioned this in here before. I think is that that's how domestic violence starts. Not many people would get in a relationship if the person you were dating instantly said, yeah, I'm going to beat you, I'm going to hurt you, I'm going to call you names and stuff like that. No, it usually starts in small incremental amounts and builds up to the event. I will say sometimes it can take a couple days and sometimes it can take years for that to occur, but that's what we see. Okay, so that's kind of the physical situational attributions of bullying, okay, that we have to be aware of. When we look at bullies, at least from an individual or individual perspective, these are some dispositional qualities that we often see. So with those two studies I just mentioned, those are the situational factors. Those are the social factors. And then we have these dispositional, such as bullies often are anxious, solitary, meaning they're very anxious about their popularity, how they're being viewed. And so they tend to try and act as the lone wolf. We tend to find when we've analyzed bullies, they tend to have a depressed mood. They have a very poor self-concept, even though oftentimes they have an exaggerated, heightened self-esteem. They have a poor understanding of who they are. They tend to have lack of self-control and lower levels of social competence and interaction. They use what's called a hostile attributions bias, meaning that every time they see certain individuals, they already put some hostile aspect to the relationship, even though that may not even be there. We see that they more often engage in things like deviant behavior, um, such as skipping school, smoking, those kinds of things at that age. We tend to see that they have lower academic achievement. And when we look at attachment, we see that they have an insecure attachment style with their parent, if you remember back when we talked about that. So the next kind of thing we should look at is what do victims report from feeling? And often they feel anxious, depressed, and poor self-concept. We found this in the Stanford prison studies with the inmates in the Stanford prison studies. Now, we luckily didn't get to the level of suicidality, but we did see a lot of loneliness and powerlessness. And if you watch the media lately, you will have probably heard the story of the young lady who, by all attributions, was a very successful young lady. She was a helper. She doing well in school, all of those types of things, but she ended up getting bullied over and over and over, which led to suicidal thoughts and then eventually her own suicide. And the thing that catches my attention about that story is this individual really was by all pictures of it, what's been reported anyways, is she was a random victim by some students at her school. She wasn't picked because she was, not social or what you would think people would bully other people would be, okay? And we do see, withdraw from school and decline in academic performance, okay? And we have seen that about half of children who are bullied never actually tell an adult. And again, we can see that in the story of the young lady. She never actually told her parents. Her parents found out all of this post her demise, okay? The other thing that we need to recognize is anti-bullying programs have limited success. Effective programs we find are longer and more intensive than just the school assemblies and posters putting on walls. And we also found that involved parents is an important aspect of anti-bullying things, because we do see both on the victim end, but also on the bully end, is an absence or a almost abusive relationship with the parent. Okay, and just as the Stanford prison studies would recognize, you have to have some type of systematic oversight and control, because when you put individuals in an uncontrolled environment and they have the ability to have authority over another individuals, as the Stanford prison studies show, as the Stanford prison studies show, it can create good people into doing really awful things, okay? The next question is does anyone really help when it comes to bullying? And the answer really is no. We see what's called a bystander effect. And I'm actually going to switch the thing, because this gets into the cycle of bullying. So we know that when there's a bullying, that there's different people that are in that group, and it tends to go through the cycle. So I'll go through these. One, bullying starts with, of course, the bully, okay? And so these are the students of bully. This is the target. These students want to bully, start bullying, and play lead roles, okay? And then often with bullies, you have the henchmen. These are the students are positive towards the bullying and take an active part. They do not usually initiate it, and they do not play a role. So the henchmen are there saying, there's, if Billy is the bully, they're like, Billy's a good guy. No, he doesn't do that. That person deserves what's happening to them. They're making it up, okay? And then Next to the henchmen is the supporters, or what we call the passive bullies. These are students actively and openly supporting the bully, for example, through laughter, conciliating to the situation, and they don't join in. So if you want to think about it, if this was Facebook bullying, okay, it would be the bully's post. The henchmen would be the ones commenting in the comments, and the supporters and passive supporters would be the ones hitting like or love, okay? And then on the next level, what we find is we have what's called passive supporters or possible bullies, okay? These are students like the bullying, but do not show outward signs of support. So these are the individuals who basically say there's nothing wrong with it. I hear this with adults who tend to be bullying. They say, bullying is part of our society and it creates character in individuals. And so we shouldn't stop it, okay? And so these are kind of more the passive supporters. So this would, if we go to our Facebook example, this person doesn't comment or doesn't like, but when someone brings up a comment about the Facebook post, they're usually the ones that say, no, it's all good. Bullying is part of child development. It's part of becoming an adult, okay? And then on the next level, we have the disengaged onlooker. These are students do not get involved and do not take a stand, nor do they participate actively in either direction. They might think or say, it's none of my business, or let's watch and see what happens. So these are the individuals who disengage themselves. They get curious, but they feel it's not their business to get involved. The disengaged onlooker is, I always think about people who go to if there's a house or a car wreck, and they'll park their car and watch to see what's going on. This is kind of that disengaged onlooker. Okay. And then the last two, now I want you to see, okay, we have 5 categories of bully and bully supporters, okay? So we have 5 different categories of people who either are tolerating it and saying it's fine, or they're actively and passively involved in the actual bullying. And we only have 2 categories of potential people who will actually maybe do something. So the possible defenders, these are students who dislike the bullying, and then they think they should help the student who is being bullied, but do nothing. So these are individuals who want to stop it, but most of the times they don't have the skills or the ability to know how to. And this is where things like bystander prevention programs can really help. And then there are the potential defenders. They dislike the bullying and help or try to help the student who is being bullied, okay? So again, if we want to look at systems of bullying, okay, and let's say there's 7 people, there's going to be 5 people in that bullying situation who support it. There's going to be 1 person who wants to get involved but doesn't know how to, and then only 1 other person who will try and actively stop the bullying behavior, okay? And I want you to think about that from an odds perspective and possibility perspective of actually being able to intervene on a bullying situation when the odds are stacked against the individual, okay? And this is what we commonly see when we see the bullying cycle, and what we see as far as what we call bystander interventions. So, okay. Does anybody have any questions on that? Yeah, letter E is disengaged onlooker. I wonder why that's coming up blurry. Okay, again. Okay. So what I want to end up with middle childhood is something we call coping and resiliency. Okay. And first of all, I want to start with the things that really can help children um, um, uh, build coping mechanisms. Okay. Uh, First one is there are individuals in the world who are lucky to have an easygoing temperament. Remember when we talked about temperament, this is a biologically set system, and there's a portion of the population that are fortunate enough to have an easygoing temperament. However, one of the things we know about taking advantage of early childhood and early childhood development is we can take a quick-tempered child or a hard-tempered child and provide them with skills that they can become as adaptable as one that is an easygoing temperament, meaning what they do is because they have a quick and hot temperament, they can learn coping skills to calm those emotions down and to calm themselves down before engaging in a situation. So when I look at this one and you're like, oh, wow, you have to have something biological. Okay, yes, they're at an advantage, but if we really work with kids, they can learn how to get to that easygoing stance of within situations. Good problem solving skills. And so this is putting children in situations where they actively have to solve problems. And of course, this probably shouldn't be surprising, either a secure attachment figure in their life, okay? And you'll notice there's an or in here, and this is important to state. Either someone that they have a secure attachment to, such as the parent, caregiver, those individuals, or they have a strong social network. So I've known many youth who went through very adverse childhoods and had very absent parents, but they had strong peer relationships. They had individuals they could go to. They had that teacher at school, for example. They had that network of individuals that help keep them balanced. Okay. So this is why this or is here is yes, a secure attachment is one route, but having strong social connections with other people is another um, aspect. Okay. And resiliency to adversity, it's a very common phenomenon of basic human adaptation systems. So we're actually wired to seek out resiliency towards adversity. And that's one other positive thing I want to say about this is that our body is constantly trying to find a way to be resilient against adverse situations. Unfortunately, sometimes those mechanisms become dysfunctional. So it might lead to, for example, substance abuse. It might lead to accepting your place, becoming helpless and hopeless, and just lying there and taking whatever's happening. Um, and the other thing that I would like to say is there's tremendous variability in outcomes. Okay, so when I talk about these resiliency skills, it's important to state that having these resiliency factors help, but even individuals who don't have these resiliency factors can survive and do really good. I often think about I had, when I was a women and children's crisis shelter manager, I had two very different women in my shelter. One left her husband because of domestic violence. And don't get me wrong, there's no justification for domestic violence or anything like this. And this is not what I'm referring to as far as this is concerned. And then the other one was in the shelter because she was severely sexually assaulted. When I say that, before she came into the shelter, she was in the hospital for about 6 months. And when you think about trauma response, you would think that one would have the event, you would think that the individual who had that more intense experience would have a harder time adapting and overcoming that. Okay. But the truth is that as far as trauma is concerned, the individual who went through that horrific situation, she got up fine. She almost like nothing had ever happened. She went out, she regained her job, she regained her housing, and she went off and she just went and did her thing. Okay. Now, don't get me wrong, in this situation, the domestic, it's still bad, but it wasn't to the intensity of this situation. The young lady who was in the other situation was, she would break a fingernail and have a trauma response, and couldn't get over it and whatnot. And the two basic difference between the two individuals is the one individual, what came from a very wealthy home. She ended up getting married, and within a month, the individual started to becoming abusive. So it's not like she had an abusive past. It started occurring within a month. She left because of well, I won't get into that. That's regardless. But she hadn't been on her own ever, and she had never had to learn kind of some basic life skills. And so she would trigger really quickly to anything negative going on in her life, right down to, I just remember she broke a nail and she couldn't handle the rest of the day. Whereas that other individual had to build her own resiliency, because in her life story, her parents were in and out of her life. She had a grandparent who, even though they were in ill health, was probably the only connection with family she ever had. And she really lived a really tough life. Okay. And this is what I mean by the tremendous variability in outcomes. Individuals you would expect to not make it sometimes do just fine. And people who seem to have that privileged life sometimes fall completely apart. So that's something just to keep in mind. So when we talk about these resiliency factors, I just want you to think about these as these provide a basic advantage to help navigate through the world. But you definitely life experience helps. So we have found that there's about 8 different type of resiliencies, assets that's a good term, assets to build resiliency. Okay. And we talked about this already, support. So that's having that secure attachment with family, caregivers, parents, or others. So for example, the ability to go talk to a school counselor in the example here. Empowerment is feeling as if you are a valued member of your community and family and that you contribute to that. Boundaries are having set rules and consequences for school, family, and relationships, both from the school, family, and the relationship, but your own as well. And not allowing people to cross those boundaries that you set for yourself. Productive use of time. So being involved, we know that being involved in school clubs, playing video games instead of playing video games and whatnot, really contribute to the health and well-being of especially young children. Positive values, so valuing things like integrity, honest, self-responsibility, equality, and justice. Social skills, the ability to interact respectfully with other people, and a positive identity. Remember when we go back to bullies, Okay, if you think about this list, there were some of the things that we listed for bullies that they tend to be weak on. One was a self-concept with it, which is a sense of full identity. Okay, and this is one area that we know that bullies lack in. Okay, and we know that they have poor boundaries, and they don't have very positive values, and that they engage in deviant type of behaviors. And we've already mentioned that they tend to have low social skills. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop there. So that's what we